literature. And I'm delighted to be moderating our presentation on Toni Morrison's Beloved. Now, I'm David Randall, Director of Research at the National Association of Scholars and your moderator, but the stars are our three panelists. Now, they are in alphabetical order. Dr. Patricia Brown is a professor of English at Azusa Pacific University in California, where she teaches numerous courses on writing and American literature. Received her PhD from the University of Illinois, where she also taught for 10 years. Her current scholarship focuses on a detailed study of the novels of Toni Morrison. Dr. Carolyn Denard is the founder and board chair of the Toni Morrison Society. She received her PhD in American Studies from Emory University. Dr. Denard taught for 15 years at Georgia State University and held leadership positions at Brown University, Emory University, Connecticut College, and Wells College. And she's contributed to critical anthologies and essay collections on Morrison's work, and is editor of What Moves at the Margin, selected nonfiction by Toni Morrison and Toni Morrison Conversations. Mrs. Julia Yost is the senior editor at First Things. She holds a BA in English from the Schreyer Honors College of Pennsylvania State University, an MA in English from Yale University, and an MFA in fiction writing from Washington University in St. Louis. There are a large number of publications associated with our panelists. They should be appearing in your chat button below, ideally in the next few minutes. If you see anything with an Amazon link, go buy in wholesale quantities from all of our panelists. This will be a good way to spend your afternoon and your monthly budget. Now, chat and Q&A buttons. Once each of the panelists has done their 12 to 14 minute individual speech, we then have Q&A discussion. The panelists are free to talk to one another, answer questions, but basically one of the things I do is simply relay questions from the chat or Q&A buttons from you, the attendees. Please put in questions, as many as you can. Your questions will make this a wonderful conversation for the final part of our program. Now, I will mention, any questions that don't get answered by the end of our program, please forward the questions again to me. That's at randall@nas.org, RANDALL@nas.org. And I will be delighted to forward your questions to the panelists so they can have the option to answer you. You do not need to worry about a question not getting answered during our time period here. And also, you don't need to worry if you're going somewhere because we're recording. And this will be recorded for posterity on the National Association of Scholars YouTube channel. It should be up within 24 hours. And that, I think, is the housekeeping. Dr. Brown, may I ask if you would go first?
All righty, you guys. I have the honor, if I should phrase it that way, of going first. And I'd like to start by trying to tackle the first question. What makes Beloved a great American novel? And I think with this prompt, I want to focus on the word American, because without question, Beloved is a great piece of literature. I mean, the narrative structure, the beautiful syntax, the use of the English language, the visceral imagery, all of that, makes Beloved, in my opinion, one of the greatest pieces of literature of all time. But, and really it is a piece of art, in terms of literary relevance. She uses a lot of sensory details, that cater to all of, the five senses. You just start with just thinking about the smell of those berries that Stampede had to pick, those berries that tasted like church, just the imagery of that, the taste, she goes from something as beautiful as that to, just imagining the taste of blood mingled with breast milk that the infant never digested. You go from, so those are smells and tastes. I meant to sort of start my timer. To just even touch, when you think of the raised skin on the back of Setha that formed that tree, just the touch of that, imagining what that felt like, and the sounds, the sound of baby Sug's calls in the clearing, especially the one about loving the flesh. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. To sights, the sight of Hallie with all of the butter and clabber smeared on his face, and the sight of Setha being violated that led him to, that insane state. So, the smells, the tastes, the sounds, the touch, all of that makes for great art and great literature. But getting back to my point, my initial point of wanting to focus on the American aspect of the novel. Of course, we know that African-American history is American history, right? And so Beloved for me is a literary rendering of American history. It invites and perhaps forces rememory of our nation's ugly past upon us. And so, Morrison, she didn't have to create fictional historical events or issues or people. I mean, reality provided that for her, for this novel. And if I had to focus on two historical moments, American historical people or moments or issues, I don't know how to phrase it, but one, of course, being Margaret Garner, whom Setha's character is based on the real life Margaret Garner. And her case speaks to the precarious nature of Black women, enslaved women, especially in relation to motherhood. Garner's response to slavery, that is, trying to, kill her children and succeeding with one. It may seem sort of extreme. It may seem like thick love, as Paul D said, or the love of someone with 4 feet and not 2. But for many, I would argue that for many enslaved women, they would see her act as an act of love, an act of mercy, an act of protection, which is in fact how I see it. It was not a barbaric act, but understanding the complexity of Black womanhood and Black motherhood is important to understanding the complexity of race and gender in America. So if you look at Setha, and of course the real life Margaret Garner, we see the importance of race and gender in America. I teach at Azusa Pacific University in California, which is a Christian university. And so we're always looking at faith integration as we're teaching. And one piece I want to focus on is the invisible church as it relates to baby Suggs. Baby Suggs giving her calls or her sermons, I mean, she really called them calls, in the clearing is a nod to what is known as the invisible church in American history. And it's important because it points to the significance of spirituality in America and the complicated nature of Christianity in America. Like motherhood, spirituality, especially Christianity, this was very complex terrain for Blacks to navigate in America. Frederick Douglass, I love what he said about it. He said, "I love the Christianity of Christ. I hate the Christianity of this land." And, as such, Blacks have had to, like Douglass and others, they've had to nourish their spiritual needs in spaces that were set apart from mainstream America. And that's where you get this invisible church happening. And so when we get to the character, the unchurched baby Suggs, and her callings, her calls in the clearing, they are indicative of this separation that has to happen in order for spiritual nourishing to happen. So when Martin Luther King said on Meet the Press in 1960 that the most segregated hour in America is Sunday morning at 11 a.m. I mean, that segregation, that segregated hour, it happened well before he even mentioned that. Then it started back with the invisible church. And so during American slavery, the invisible church, like we see in the clearing and beloved, it's established for a number of reasons, the invisible church, and well, on a practical level, because of racial segregation. But more importantly, the invisible church, it's established to nourish the spiritual needs of slaves in a way that white churches could not or would not function. In fact, it wasn't uncommon for the invisible church to contradict the white Christian church. For example, slaves would proclaim that salvation was for everyone, not just for whites, and that God was on this side of the oppressed. And there's a number of ways the invisible church contradicted the mainstream white Christian church. So if you take, for example, in Beloved, baby Suggs, her call about loving the flesh, and I just, I have that on a poster, the entire sermon, if you will, if you want to call it a sermon, on a poster right here in my office. But this is the opposite of what traditional preachers teach, about the flesh. Traditionally in Christianity, we hear about, that there's no good thing dwells in the flesh. The flesh, we're constantly trying to deny our flesh. The flesh is the enemy of the spirit, etc. Well, baby Suggs, she tells this ex-slave community to love your flesh and to cherish your Black flesh, which is different from what we hear with traditional Christian teachings about the flesh. And why is this important? It's important because American society was, and perhaps still is, set up to hate and destroy the Black body. And this is kind of what Ta-Nehisi Coates was saying in Between the World and Me, in his book Between the World and Me, when he's focusing on the killings of Blacks by police officers. It was more than just the act of taking one's life, Ta-Nehisi Coates says, but rather it's more than just the destruction of the body, but it's a destruction of one's humanity. It's the destruction of one's personhood, one's existence. And so you have to cherish and love your flesh, that neck, those hands, those fingers, the guts, the liver, the dark liver. You have to cherish that. And so Suggs's sermon, or her call, it was just as spiritual as any Christian sermon could be, and perhaps more relevant for her audience there in the clearing. There are a number of other pieces of American history embedded in the novel, but we'll save that for another day. So if I could answer the prompt in a nutshell, what makes Beloved a great American novel is that it uses American history to thrust the reader into the lives of African Americans pre and post slavery. And in the foreword of the novel, Morrison said that there would be no introduction into the novel. She says, I wanted the reader to be kidnapped, thrown ruthlessly into the alien environment, just as the slave characters were snatched from one place to another without preparation or defense. And so that's what makes it a great American novel, is that she just snatches you the moment that you pick up this book, and she just thrusts you into American history. Let's see, my timer went off. Okay, maybe about 2 more minutes, and then I'll just turn it over to Carolyn to the second prompt about who or to what does beloved refer to. Beloved, the character can be, of course, interpreted. I've read so many articles about ways to interpret it. Paul D, at the end, when he encounters Denver, he asks her, "Do you really think that that was your sister?" And she says, "At times. And at times, I think she was something more." And I think she is more than just a character, a ghost, etc. I like to think of her sometimes as the personification of slavery, or the way that the characters respond to or cope with slavery. Beloved is not among the living. I mean, she is a manifestation of the living, of Satha, Paul D, Denver, etc. She can only exist for those who allow her to exist. Satha, she allows her to exist because she struggles with the guilt of her actions, the actions that were caused by slavery. So, the personification of slavery. And the only way that she knows how to undo the damage of slavery and to ask for forgiveness is to allow beloved to dwell with her. And for Denver, she allows beloved to exist because beloved serves as sort of a buffer between reality that, my mother could possibly kill me too, cutting the head off, and the fantasy of what my mother did could possibly be rectified. And, Paul D, he is the one character who fights this manifestation or this personification of slavery, with the tin box, keeping it sealed shut. And, he fights beloved's existence because she is an evil reminder of the psychological bondage of slavery. And this is why he has to cast out her ghost. And the fact that beloved is able to return in the flesh and overpower Paul D, both, sexually, mentally, and physically, it speaks to the depth of damage that slavery has caused Paul D. So yeah, beloved it can refer to so much, the idea of rememory or disremembering. At the end, it says, this was not a story to pass on to the next generation, yet Morrison writes a novel and passes it on. And it moves beyond the mere retelling of a story towards, the story of the horrors of slavery, but she passes on not just the story of slavery, but she passes on people. These are actual, individuals, not just or slave women or slave men or slave children, but this is Setha, this is Denver, this is the 50-mile or 30-mile woman. This is Paul D, this is Sixo. These are actual people. She humanizes them. And so this is something that has to be passed on. And so for these people, rememory has to occur, but not in a controlling way, that allows a type of beloved ghost to sort of take up residence in your home or in your heart or in your mind. In that case, of course, she says, at the end that remembering seems unwise, but beloved can be so much. So I'll stop there and I'll perhaps chime in for the next 2 prompts.
Thank you,
Carolyn.
Oh, yes, thank you so much. Yes, Dr. Denard.
Well, thank you, Dr. Brown. I enjoyed listening to that and certainly agree with your assessment of Beloved as, sort of a major artistic work, and Morrison being an American writer and writing about American history, the African-American slave past, certainly makes it, in large measure because of the gravitas that Morrison gives to that story, makes it a very important story for an American novel. What I'd like to add to that, certainly, I think Beloved is a great American novel because it also incorporates what we have talked about in American studies as sort of perennial themes in American culture that are made manifest in great American novels. Morrison's Beloved, Huck Finn, Light in August, the whole Faulkner series. And so I think in addition to it being an excellently written novel about American life, it is also a novel that incorporates an important part of American history. It's also a novel that affirms freedom and independence. And those are certainly American values, and we have to, there is an overlay of slavery here, but Setha's urgency in getting her own independence is quite an American act. She says, when I left Kentucky and I came to Ohio, I could be me. I could open my arms wide. I could make decisions about yes and no and what my children could do. And that was a sense of freedom for her, that she was willing to go through the trials of that escape and departure in order to realize. So I think that there is in the story of Setha, which is incorporated in Beloved, a true American affirmation of freedom and independence. I think that this story also is a story about a moral choice. I think that when I have taught, for example, Huck Finn, and Huck says at the end, when he's got to decide whether he's going to turn Jim in or not, and whether he's going to go to hell according to the structures of the culture that he grew up in, and he thinks about it for a long time. He says, I was between a rock and a hard place. And he finally had to go with his own experiential moment with Jim. And he says, well, I'll just go to hell. And he makes that decision to do what he thinks is the right thing to do. And I think Setha makes that same kind of decision when Paul D says to her, your love is too thick. And she says, too thick. Love is or it ain't. Thin love ain't no love at all. And he goes on to say, your sons are gone, you're here alone. And her retort is, school teacher ain't got him. It's not my job to know what's worse. It's my job to know what is. And I made that decision for my children to leave in that way. I made that decision. I was willing to make that decision to take their lives rather than have them go back into that slavery. So all of the external structures said, this is not the right thing to do. You don't take the life of your children. You don't put them through, subject them to that kind of horror. And she says the decision she had to make was based on what she knew was worse. And she protected them from that. And I think that here is that moral choice that you often see in American literature, whether it's the Huck Finn example I gave, or whether it's in Silas Lapham, William Dean Howells, or whether it's in there is always that moment where you have to make a choice between the experiential reality, the moral code that you develop based on your experience, and this artificial code that is out there in the world that can dictate that this is not what you should do. There's a certain kind of bravery in that. And, in thinking about the answer to this question, to think about that in terms of, I think, like Dr. Brown, I'm a little skeptical about embracing an American thematic over this novel, but in terms of, because America for us has been such an exclusionary experience, but in terms of the themes that occur in American literature, I think, and the question being, what makes this a great American novel? And to me, in addition to the history that it is tearing open and allowing us to see in the horror and fullness of it, it is also, and I don't think Morrison was unaware that this was also something that she was putting forth, that this is what happens in American literature. People choose freedom. They make a experiential moral choice over a dictated choice by structures. I think it's also an optimistic novel. It ends, after the horrible ordeal of what goes on 124. At the end, when it's all over, and Paul D says, we have to have some kind of future together. And Setha is a bit incredulous about that. Me, she says, yes, she says, you are your own best thing. And to me, that whole, it's going to be okay. It's going to, we can go forward with an optimistic future is also an American, kind of American way of looking at the world. When I've taught and had students who were international students visiting, and we've asked this question in my American Lit classes, and they said, well, Americans are eternally optimistic. They always think it's going to be better and better. And so you can see in Beloved that there is this moment of optimism, which for many women, for many of those who have been excluded and downtrodden and gone through horrible ordeals, that is really one of the most affirming moments of this text, to say, I guess in addition to the sermon that the baby Suggs gives, which is the same kind of thing, is to love yourself and to be willing to go forward. And I think those thematics also make it an American text. And finally, I'll say that it is a novel that is a memorial. When she was asked why did she feel that she needed to write Beloved, she said, at the time, this is 1988, she says there was no place, no memorial, no skyscraper, no 300-foot tower. She says there wasn't a tree carved in Mississippi or Savannah or Georgia or anywhere where we could go and remember the lives of those who died. And because she said there was no place, and her final saying, there was not even a small bench by the road, which is a metaphor that the Toni Morrison Society has accepted as really a charge to put actual benches by the road in places where what happened there, the triumphs that happened at these places have been forgotten. And so we have taken that. So the book is also an American memorial. And I think that those things, the great writing that Dr. Brown has referred to, the cultural thematics that I am putting forth, and this notion that it is an American memorial to something that we have otherwise forgotten, I think makes it a great American novel. I think in terms of who Beloved and what Beloved refers to, I think in certainly on very specific levels, to the daughter that she lost, it's pretty clear in the novel who Beloved is. Metaphorically, I think, and thematically, Beloved is all of those things and people and places that we have loved and lost, and that we have not properly acknowledged or embraced in our lives. And so calling them the beloved reclaims that love, reclaims that loss, and in some ways articulates, the real sadness of losing those that we love and we cannot get back, at least not in the flesh. And we have to think about the beloved in metaphorical terms, in memory. And so I think that beloved refers to all of those places and people and things that we have loved and lost and that we want to reclaim. I think Morrison was influenced, and I think her MA thesis probably is the best indication of the writers that she was most interested in, and that's William Faulkner and Virginia Woolf. And I think where Morrison and Faulkner see the world the same, or why she was perhaps attracted to his work, is because of the long view that Faulkner gives, the willingness to, rename a county in Mississippi and make it a mythical place, to think of what is happening there in the long view. And if you have, lived in those small towns in Mississippi as I have, it's a pretty everyday, mundane life of facing racism and the remnants of slavery and the discrimination and segregation and all those things. And there's also those small community lives, like the communities that I grew up in, that kept you from that affirmed who you were, that, went to church and went to school and built a community of love. And to have a writer to take those kinds of everyday moments in the lives of those communities and mythologize them, I think was a great benefit that Faulkner did to small town American life, to race, and to Mississippi in particular. And I think Morrison does that too. I mean, the Song of Solomon is probably her best example of that, here we are down on the ground, but we are also up in the sky. It's a major kind of moment, to talk about what's going on. I think Tar Baby, a novel that isn't read as much, is a really important work of showing how even our domestic lives, our romantic lives, have those mythical implications. And that is the thing that I love most about Morrison. I mean, when I read Song of Solomon, it was sort of for the first time I understood my father, who did not migrate from Mississippi to Chicago, and the angst that he was carrying as a result of that, wanting to fly, wanting so much to transcend what he was in, but could not. And so reading Song of Solomon helped me do that. But that is the point that I'm making, is that this whole kind of being willing, having the ability to add the mythical dimension to ordinary lives, I think is Morrison's debt. And maybe I don't want to say debt so much as something she shares with Faulkner. And I think Virginia Woolf, the poeticism of Virginia Woolf, I think Morrison appreciated that. She was certainly a master storyteller, just a genius in the use of language. And so I think those writers did influence her. I think she was also influenced by Gabriel Garcia Marquez, willing to add this kind of mythical notion to a diasporic community and to give that affirmation and place in the individual lives of people. So I think those three writers, in my mind, are writers that really did influence her writing. I think she was also a great comrade of James Baldwin's, and really saw the race issue through the same lens as Baldwin. And I think some of her nonfiction work certainly suggests that it was beautiful and it was political, and Morrison embraced both of those things. So I think those writers, Baldwin, Marquez, Virginia Woolf, William Faulkner, were some of the writers that influenced Morrison, or that she felt a comradeship with. In terms of who she has influenced, I think she had no doubt. If you're a young writer, in the 90s and you were reading Toni Morrison, there's no doubt that you were influenced by her. But I think she has particularly influenced Black women writers, Jessamine Ward, Edgewood Dunticott, Tiara Jones. I think with Jessamine Ward, who is also from Mississippi and has her lens, her gaze on that small town, was really empowered by how Morrison could take those very small moments in the lives, the difficult moments, the bluest eye moments, the Sula moments, all of those moments, and make them larger than they were, and to show their impact to a wider audience, the difficulties, the sadness, the rejection, the diminishing, and the triumph. So I think that Jessamine was certainly influenced, or is certainly influenced by Morrison. And I think with Edgewood Dunticott, willing to bring that kind of diasporic mysticism, the supernatural, the mythical to that work. I think Edgewood does that in her work as well. And then Tiare, it seems to me, has embraced that domestic Toni Morrison, the tar baby Toni Morrison, who's willing to, I think in American Marriage, for example, there is that, the crux of that is a romantic kind of awakening. And Tiare is able to demonstrate the historical and the cultural implications of something that happens in the bedroom. And Morrison was able to do that too. So I think those writers, and certainly there are others who were influenced by Morrison. I think that the honesty, the humor, the belief systems, the myth, all of that is in the writings of these young writers. And then finally, Morrison will certainly have a grand place in American literature, just the volume of her work alone. When you write 11 novels and you edit four edited editions and you write your own criticism, I mean, the Morrison's library is just amazing. It's amazing. And their children's books, their librettos, there's, she was a Renaissance woman in no uncertain terms. And so she will be remembered and revered for how prolific she was as a writer, first and foremost. But she was also able, I think, in a way that perhaps was new for many of us who have been reading African-American literature a long time, to affirm our diasporic connections, to affirm our worldview and our beliefs, as she likes to say, she took the poison out of the lives we lived and affirmed what we knew and how we made decisions and our worldview. And so there is a real sense of the affirmation of African-American life in spite of all of the things that happened to them. I mean, Beloved is certainly a prime example of all of the things that are going on in the background. And here we have a story where someone like Baby Suggs can give that sermon in the clearing while holding in mind what happens to, here's a woman being held down and her breast milk taken by white men who worked on the plantation. And out of that can come still this affirmation of love. And I think that Morrison was able to reposition African-American life and culture and endurance as a triumph. And I will just be forever grateful for that, that it gave me a new critical eye on everything that was said about us. I kept people in check because of my reading of Morrison. And I think she also provided this searing critique of American life. And she did that in the novels, she did that in the essays, and in the nonfiction. So Morrison was just a real giant of an intellect, of an artist, of a historian, of a Black woman. And I think she embraced all that meant, the gender, the race, the culture, the worldview, all of that. She brought that to her work. And so you couldn't not understand that and appreciate that if you read Morrison. So I think that she will be and is the greatest American writer of our times right now, because she brought all of that, Faulkner and more. It's just not just one worldview. He couldn't see, maybe more than most, Faulkner could see the other side. But, writers like Fitzgerald or Hemingway or Chopin or whoever you consider a great American writer, their worldview was narrow compared to Morrison's. And so she brings a broader worldview to American literature. And I think that for that reason, she is a great American writer and beloved. Her tour de force was a great American novel.
Thank you so much. Mrs. Yost, may I ask if you would be our third speaker?
Happy to. Thank you. I'm going to go, unfortunately, over a lot of ground that Dr. Brown and Dr. Denard have already covered extremely well. So forgive any redundancy, but I take slightly different angles. And fortunately, this is a rich text, which allows that. So my remarks will be concerned largely with the question, who or what is beloved or beloved in the novel? And at the end of that, time permitting, I have a couple of minutes of remarks on Beloved as a spiritual novel. So I want to begin with a really basic but still extraordinary fact about the character called Beloved, and that is that she is a ghost who's taken on flesh. You don't see that all that often, and I think it's worth pondering why Morrison chose to incarnate a ghost and what that choice means. Like Dr. Brown, I'm really taken with this novel's conviction of the necessity of loving one's flesh. And by flesh is certainly meant one's kin, and certainly also one's own body. And this can't really be done under slavery, which prevents Black people from forming families, keeping their families together, and it abuses and humiliates their bodies. And it's not about having a decent master or a cruel one, a Garner or a school teacher. The predicate remains. So Paul D says that their dignity rested on Garner being alive. Now, ain't that slavery, or what is it? So it's only after they attain freedom that the Black characters are free to love themselves and each other. If even then, so the character Ella, who works on the Underground Railroad, advises Setha against ever loving anyone or anything on either side of the Mason-Dixon. But Baby Suggs, of course, as the spiritual leader, at least to the free Black community in Cincinnati, thinks it's very important to help former slaves see themselves as loving and lovable. And I suspect that she has this in common with Morrison herself, a sort of concern with the self-esteem of Black Americans, a sense that they must be beloved of themselves and each other, and that the legacy of slavery imposes very real challenges to that even today. So how is that brought about? As Dr. Brown has said so well, the imperative is embrace the flesh. Baby Suggs preaches, in this place here we flesh that weeps, laughs, flesh that dances on bare feet in grass. Love it hard. Yonder they do not love your flesh, they despise it. And there's quite a bit more in that vein. And this lesson obviously is important for former slaves whose flesh has been sold, its monetary value has been calculated, its human and animal characteristics have been tabulated, it's endured violence, above all sexual violence, which I think is kind of paradigmatic in this novel. And so what is the remedy? How do you instruct the flesh that it's now beloved? The novel provides in great abundance these motifs of physical comfort and soothing, whether that's Baby Suggs massaging Setha's neck, Amy massaging her feet, Paul D touching her back, the women of 124 grooming each other, doing each other's hair, or food. There's a lot of food in this novel. Setha cooks and bakes for a living, and we get a lot of really nice detail on that. Baby Suggs' feast for 90 people is, I think, exemplary. It's this very elaborately described impromptu meal with the blackberries and the pies and the perch and the rabbit and the corn pudding and the watermelon snow cones. And so by sharing and enjoying this food, the free Blacks of Cincinnati can celebrate their freedom and their flesh and their ability to love and be loved. And there's baby Suggs doing her thing, loving, cooking, cooking, loving, which is such a nice phrase. And then it gives way to envy and resentment because they're human beings after all, which is good psychological realism. But Setha's breast milk receives great, great emphasis, in part, I think, because it is the flesh producing soothing nourishment for the flesh, which brings us to the character called Beloved. As an incarnate ghost, she's reconciling spirit and flesh in a surprising way. And the text is really attentive to Beloved's physicality, not just hers, but certainly hers. And her physicality is quite ambiguous. It's shifty. When she first appears, she's this beautiful, slender woman of 20, though like a newborn, she can't support her own head. Later, she becomes this kind of vampire figure. She's feeding on Setha's guilt and her memories of trauma. And at the same time, she's eating all the food in the house. So she waxes as Setha wanes, both physically and spiritually, and Beloved's flesh becomes grotesque. Even her feet get fat. Like, you have to gain a lot of weight before you go up a shoe size. And I think in this phase of the novel, we observe a representation of trauma's narcissism, the kind of perverse self-love of the endless self-regarding, dwelling on injury and guilt. And the result in the symbolic economy is that the flesh that should be lovable and beloved becomes repulsive. But Beloved's final appearance in the novel is really striking. So on the porch during the exorcism scene, she's naked. She seems to be once again slender and beautiful, and she's very glamorously pregnant. You know, we're told that she has long, straight limbs and this bowling ball belly. And I find this really fascinating. It wasn't clear to me that she was pregnant before that scene. And so since when is that happening, and how? I mean, in the natural way, or is this more strictly supernatural and symbolic? Where did the weight go? What's her secret? Why is her flesh on display now more than ever and suddenly very attractive again? And for me, this all raises questions about just what this incarnate ghost is supposed to mean for us at this juncture in the story, whether her exorcism by the community is entirely good and whether it can entirely succeed. Obviously, we have to understand Beloved at one level as the return of the repressed, right? So as has been said, this novel is really insistent on the need for characters to move past repression, confront their memories of trauma, unlock the tobacco tin, stop beating back the past. So the exorcism of Beloved can be read really neatly in Freudian terms. If you want to stop being haunted by the past, you need to elicit the memory of trauma. In this case, there's a white man in a buggy coming for your daughter. Confront it, integrate it into the narrative of your life, and move on from it. And so Beloved disappears or explodes after this incident because, having confronted her past, Setha is no longer haunted by it. So it's basically the talking cure. And when Paul D returns to 124, there's this optimistic rhetoric about telling each other their stories in order to move on. He wants to set his story next to hers. Setha, we got more yesterday than anybody. We need some kind of tomorrow. And that all makes good Freudian sense. But we're told in the closing chapter then that everyone forgot Beloved like a bad dream. So it seems that we're back to amnesia again, which is odd. How are we to take this? It's a really ambiguous chapter. One of the interesting features of it is it has this chorus-like refrain. It was not a story to pass on. This is not a story to pass on. And it's possible that we could read that to mean this is not a story to refuse or overlook. But obviously the plainest meaning is this story deserves to be forgotten. And so in that refrain, we seem almost to be hearing the voice of those 30 women who came to exercise 124, led by Ella, who has a very repressive attitude toward the past. She regards it as something to leave behind. If it didn't stay behind, well, you might have to stomp it out. Just like Setha initially was always beating it back, which is something the novel has required her to stop doing. So I just wonder whether exorcism was quite the right ritual for Beloved. Maybe instead of being expelled and forgotten, she should have been mourned and commemorated. What would baby Suggs do? when baby Suggs got women together for a ritual, she commanded them to cry for the living and the dead, which is different from telling the dead to get out of town. At any rate, the repressed returns as you'd expect. So I understand Morrison to have felt that in order to be beloved of themselves and each other, Black Americans need to honor their ancestors, and that means learning and telling their stories, no matter how terrible. This novel speaks of the Black and angry dead and suggests that their suffering is a psychological inheritance for all Black Americans. At least I think that's the suggestion. It suggests the permeability of past and present and of all the generations. So, as has been said, Paul D asks Denver whether she thinks Beloved really was her sister, and Denver answers, at times I think she was more. And when we had access to Beloved's subjectivity, we saw that she seems to have memories of the Middle Passage. So she seems to represent all the tens of millions of victims of slavery, and her footprints after she's disappeared match all shapes and sizes. I take it she could be any Black American slave or free. Her story is not just hers. So I think that this claim that the novel is making on her behalf is motivated partly by the difficult truth that any story of slavery is kind of required to signify beyond itself, because American slaves were such a vast cohort which remains almost voiceless and storyless. And so the few stories that we do have kind of have a heavy burden to carry. More optimistically, I think the novel is offered as a sort of communal talking cure. Its characters find that their memories are most easily born if they are turned into stories and shared and understood as instances of a common experience. So a therapeutic promise of the novel is that all Black Americans may become beloved by learning and passing on the story of Beloved. Let me check my timer. Yeah, okay. 2 minutes on Beloved as a spiritual novel, not just in the sense that it has a ghost, but in the sense that it contains a kind of spirituality. I've just spoken of the novels addressed to Black Americans, and it's surely the case that Black readers are addressed by it in a special and direct way, but it obviously has meaning and appeal for all interested readers. And one way in which to characterize, I think, one kind of universalized lesson of the novel is, it carries a kind of spirituality of self-realization. Now, Patty and Carolyn, who are actual scholars, will correct me if I have this wrong, but my sense is that Morrison's work shows the influence of a kind of democratized reading of the Gnostic strand of early Christianity, which is a body of scholarship that was attracting a lot of interest, I think, in the 70s and 80s. And that comports very nicely with American individualism, sort of values of freedom and self-determination. So in this spirituality, one great imperative is self-knowledge. You either save yourself by achieving self-knowledge, or you destroy yourself by failing to. Jesus in the Gospel of Thomas, which is a Gnostic text, says, if you bring forth what is within you, what you bring forth will save you. If you do not bring forth what is within you, what you do not bring forth will destroy you. Which could have been the epigraph to Beloved. It's not. The actual epigraph is from Romans. But the stakes of self-knowledge in the novel are, I think, not just that we cannot be haunted by trauma forever. We can't live that way. We have to confront it, integrate it. But also that, the divine spark is in there. And that's your redemption. So baby Suggs doesn't tell people in the clearing to go and sin no more. She tells them that the only grace they could have was the grace they could imagine. And Paul D tells Seth that you're your best thing. So there's a kind of a spirituality of self-knowledge and self-affirmation, which strikes me as just very American. And Morrison is a very eloquent and persuasive exponent of it, I think, in Beloved and probably elsewhere. So that's my first things take on the great Americanness of this novel, and also maybe an indication of Morrison's place in, shall we say, the American canon of literature or scripture. That's all I got.
Thank you so much. Thank you, all of you. Now, we have a bunch of questions, which I'm going to be springboarding off of happily, but I'll just say to everyone who is watching, put in your questions now. Put in lots of questions so we can have lots of stuff. I have a question I want to sort of bounce off of. Robin Latimer. I think she had Hester Prynne in mind from Hawthorne, as well as Faulkner in writing Beloved. The Gothic element and the story of an evil and debased Christian hypocrisy. I guess I want to push that actually towards an examination of Beloved as a horror novel. That is, it is quite striking that, as a number of you have been saying, this is a ghost come to life, and quite visibly, that this is, how should I put this? She's not just, it's not Ralph Ellison and Mark Twain just, it is Herman Melville, the horrific white whale. It is Nathaniel Hawthorne, the minister's black veil. It is the turn of the screw. It is the Masque of the Red Death. And I guess one thing I want to sort of precisely say is, well, how much is she consciously part of the horror tradition? How much is this a specifically American horror tradition? And I guess I would say one of the interesting things you can do with horror is that you can, or indeed any of these more expressive works, you can come up with a symbol which is open to interpretation. What does the white whale mean? What does the black veil mean? What does the red mask mean? Is the ghost come to life a similarly open symbol for the reader? Is she trying to have the reader have different ways of interpreting that horror, or is it a more closed interpretation? For any and all of you, and ideally all of you, seriatim.
I go back to what Denver says, I think she's more, she's something more. So I don't think it's really a closed interpretation of a horror story. The connotations of horror for me are, scary, terrible. And in that sense, I never really see, because I see Beloved, the novel, as such a beautiful story, a horrifically beautiful story. I rarely see it as a horror story because I don't necessarily see or get anything beautiful out of horror. But I get so many wonderful, edible moments out of Beloved, even though it is the horrific past of America's slavery, but as Denver said, it's more. It's not closed. It's a number of ways of viewing it, the horror element of it.
Dr. Denard, Mrs. Yost?
I know there are old notions of horror and newer notions of horror, but I think that I agree with Patty. I think that the intent here is more redemptive, more transformative in a positive way than a horror story that seems to be just out to frighten. The goal is just to frighten. This is not just that is not the goal of Beloved. And to me, that's the major difference, that it is not sort of a commercialization of horror. It's really and a really difficult task of trying to show the real depths of how the horror of slavery affected people on an individual level. So I just think the intent of this novel is more redemptive than what we might think of as a horror story.
Yeah, I think maybe the only thing I would add is that, for sure, Morrison is not trying to participate in the commercial genre of horror. One thing that does strike me is, insofar as horror is distinguished from, say, suspense, or even in older terms, horror is distinguished from terror. I think horror tends to be implicated with the flesh and just very up close encounters with injured or injuring flesh. And there are an awful lot of horrifying images in the novel of injured flesh, or something like even Paul D with the bit in his mouth, and the chicken grinning at him. That's yeesh. That kind of gets to me. So there are these elements. There are these little images and elements in play, which I think it's one nice thing about Morrison is that she's not snooty about these things. She's not going to aestheticize it so much that you can't get the visceral reaction that it really deserves. So to that extent, I do think there's something to the idea that this is a work of horror. Though I agree, the final intent is far more elevated and more redemptive. And your question, David, about the symbolism, the central symbolism surrounding Beloved, I totally agree with Dr. Brown that I think Beloved was intended to be absolutely multivalent and really finally elusive. I don't think she can be boiled down finally.
Thank you. I will go to another question, or actually two, from Jabud and Sola Gratua, both following up on Dr. Denard. She took the poison out of the lives we lived. A comment that this is one and brilliant. What is the source of that quote? And then could one expand on that? Can you expand on the implications of that relatively brief sentence? And if other people wish to comment on it too, but the question was directly to Dr. Denard.
Okay, thank you. She says that in an interview really early in her career. I think it was an interview with Paula Giddens in Encore magazine, maybe 76. It might be in that collection of interviews that's in my collection of interviews or in the Neil Taylor Guthrie's collection. It might be in there. But what Morrison is saying then is that she likes to put her characters under duress, and she wants to find out why people survive and how. And so she says that, you have to, and I think in that particular instance, she was talking about how you can feel bad about a lot of things. She was a single mother raising two sons, and, how do you fix this window, and how do you put this knob back on, and, that kind of thing. And she said, you just have to take the poison out of it. You just have to do what you have to do. And don't you contribute to making it so horrible. And I think that she's done that in her work about Black lives. I mean, not that she's omitted the poison or we don't know about it, but she's shown how people survive in spite of it. And that was the source of that quote, that we can be self-agents in our own recovery.
Yeah, I like that. I never heard that quote. But I think when I think of poison, I think of something that is bound to kill you, So if you take the poison out of the poison, then there's hope. And I like the idea that poison is still poison, but if you take the poison out of poison, it doesn't kill you. And so you manage to still exist and thrive and move on. You learn how to be that single mother, you learn how to fix things. And so it's still, the circumstances haven't changed, but you've managed to take the element that would kill you in those circumstances out. Note to self.
Thank you. And Mrs. Yost, do you want to add to this? Or?
No, that does it for me.
All right. Well, in that case, you're on next for another question from Sola Gratua. For Julia Yost, love the connection between self-knowledge and salvation. Baby Suggs was a model of spiritual endurance, but she eventually gave up. So can we still draw truth and inspiration from her positive exhortations to the community? Can a sinning priest still save? I added that last one.
Oh gosh. I mean, she's only human, right? I think we can, because, you know, Baby Suggs remains this positive, this positive inspiration for characters long after her death. You know, I think when Denver is trying to kind of pull things together and think, okay, how do I save my mother? How do I make this work at the end of the novel? I believe she's thinking of Baby Suggs and sort of, what would Baby Suggs do? What would she tell me to do? So yes, a sinning or simply an exhausted priest can still propound salvific teaching for sure. And you know, and I just think that you know, her gospel, to the extent that her gospel is about knowing yourself and loving yourself, that is what comes through at the end of the novel. And you know, Paul D's conversation with Setha, "You your best thing," and Setha is just so surprised. She says, "Me?" And that's, I think, a kind of a moment of like really shattering hope and optimism, which we conclude on, you know, for her character. And so it's very real, and it endures and is carried on. But you know, I mean, life is hard, and sometimes you're sad on your deathbed. It just happens.
I don't think we have to see death as giving up. I mean, you know, the work you do is the work you do, and it's the legacy you leave. And it's like Ms. Yost says, I mean, we die. we all, that happens. And so it is about the legacy that that Baby Suggs gives, you know, the gift of the admonishment to love yourself.
Yeah, in terms of the spiritual element, I like to, you know, think of one of my colleagues. She published an article about Baby Suggs quitting the word and why she quit preaching. But I like to take that a bit further, that even though she stopped going to the clearing and she ultimately just settles for requests of color, you know, a little pink, a little blue, yellow never did anyone any harm. But after she dies, it's like the Holy Spirit, you know, after Christ ascends into heaven, he leaves the Holy Spirit, you know, behind. And I see the spirit of Baby Suggs being left behind. It is the spirit of Baby Suggs, kind of like the Holy Spirit, that encourages Denver to step out and out of the yard and go out to get help. And so that becomes a type of salvation, not just for Denver, but for Setha and for Paul D, because, you know, that sort of pulls him back too. And so she has a lasting effect beyond her quitting the word.
Thank you. I have a question. This is even prompted by me, I think. I'm always a little dissatisfied when people talk about religiosity in generic terms. And I guess I want to ask, to what extent is Beloved articulating, let's give us categories, a particularly American religious ethic? How much is it, you know, rendering, say, you know, a Presbyterian or a Baptist, you know, a particular denominational ethic? How much, you know, precisely African American religion and subdivided African American religions. In effect, how much is it speaking to the particulars of religion in its time and place, and how much is it making a statement about a generic Christianity?
I don't know about generic Christianity. When I teach my graduate course, one of the unique elements of our graduate program is that we incorporate Christianity with literature. But Morrison is a little different. And so when I teach the course on Morrison, the title of the course is Toni Morrison and Matters of Faith and Spirituality. And so I don't necessarily focus on Christianity. You certainly see the influence of Christianity in all of her works, but I think that she has broadened, she's taken Christianity, she's broadened it in many ways that, that African Americans tend to do, to a greater understanding of faith and spirituality. So I wouldn't call it a generic form of Christianity or watered down form of Christianity, but I like to think of, because African Americans really tend to be spiritual, a spiritual exploration of matters of faith. I don't know if that can answer the question.
Restricted to Christianity either. It does seem to me that it's more spiritual and belief in, these are, those 30-mile women are praying and singing, but they are protesting. They are fighting women. They are not, there's no fear or mysticism about the afterlife. They are really here to do the work of now, and they believe that they have the power to actualize that in their invoking of that spirit. So I'm a bit uncomfortable with this being an American religion, or I don't think Morrison is really going there, but I do think she is asserting a very strong faith system, a strong belief system. And I mean, it's Baby Suggs' sermon, it's the songs of the women who come to Seth's home. It's about God and me. It's what I'm invoking the Spirit of God, but I am here doing the work. And I'm not sure that there's I love the fact that there isn't a kind of passivity about it, that is the work that we must do. So I don't know where that falls in the paradigm of American religions, but maybe say something to that. I don't know.
Mrs. Yost, do you wish to add to this?
I mean, I guess I would just say I'm not an Americanist, so I don't have expertise in 19th century American Christianity. So I'm not sure whether Morrison is interested in the kind of particularities of the kind of Christianity that an unchurched preacher like Baby Suggs would have preached. But my sense from the book is that Baby Suggs is she's just doing her thing. She's speaking from what she knows. She's preaching the insight she has come by. And so I don't think it's generic. But I certainly don't think it's denominationally bound in any way. And how exactly it sort of fits in with any specificity Morrison might have held to about religion or spirituality. I'm no expert on that either. It does seem to me that I just get the impression that Baby Suggs kind of speaks for Morrison in a way. Maybe that's presumptuous. Maybe it's presumptuous to say that, but she does seem, it seems like her insights are distinctly valorized in the novel. So again, yeah, where you map that onto the sort of geography of American spirituality is not totally clear. Yeah.
Thank you. I have a comment from CN, well, two, I think, actually, talking about the sense of wonder, introducing the idea of wonder in this novel. And I guess I'm going to compress that a little bit, but to what extent is Beloved a novel of wonder, and how does the wonder work, to forward the novel?
Sure, it depends a bit on what you mean by wonder, but one thing that strikes me about the kind of aesthetics of the novel is that there are these beautiful landscapes, especially at Sweet Home, and there are places in which horrible things happened and were done. So I think both Setha and Paul D remember sort of feelings of wonder or marveling at the natural beauty around them. And that memory really, really sticks with them. And I think Setha says explicitly, or thinks explicitly at one point that when she thinks of Sweet Home, she sees that wondrous landscape and responds to that memory very positively. And she sort of can't forgive it for that because there were much more important, terrible things happening at the same time. So there is this kind of this irony of you can live amidst beauty and brutality at the same time. So that's just a paradox that is it's a motif in there. I'm not sure if it's probably carried through in some larger way that I haven't thought through yet. I don't know if my co-panelists have anything to add to that.
Dr. Denard, Dr. Brown?
Well, I've just never thought of this as, maybe my notion of wonder is a bit more kind and unserious, but and maybe the person who asked the question needs to kind of give more sense of what he or she means by wonder. If it's about unlimited possibility and the willingness to think about things in that way, but maybe that's what they mean. But wonder puts this in a category of it being unserious in my mind, and so I don't know that I'm.
I should say I shortened. Sorry, one thing the person said was, Beloved has remained such an incredibly powerful medium because of that jewel of wonder that it introduces, of choosing to see something so horrifying in a truly radical way, to allow oneself that agency, the core and final key of choice. I'm sorry, I did abbreviate that somewhat. But that's, I think, more of what the longer version of it.
Is it like wonder, like the marvel of it?
Yeah,
Okay.
I mean, the sublime, I suppose, in some sense, but the sublime linked to human liberty. Oh, sorry, you're muted again.
Thing off. Sorry, he said it was. He described the wonder as the ability to do what?
To choose to see something so horrifying in a truly radical way, to allow oneself that agency, the core and final key of choice. That's actually, by the way, that may be one of the more beautiful comments we've ever gotten on these webinar series. I'll just say that.
Oh, I don't know. I feel that, I guess because I feel that Morrison is in control of what is being revealed, that it feels less like freedom to me in that way to see. I just feel like it's more controlled than that, but maybe has something to add.
Well, I will perhaps then shift to a different question if there's not an overwhelming desire to pursue wonder. Another question I want to slightly shift a little bit from Daniel. How does Beloved rank among Morrison's others novels? And I want to shift that. I am going to presume that each of Morrison's novels has its own unique virtues, not all of which Beloved pursues. So I guess I'd ask you, among her other lovely novels, what are some of the things that some of them do that Beloved doesn't? So, she tries different things in the course of her career. What are some other, so what are some other virtues that some of her other novels particularly possess?
Well, I think when you think about family relationships, understanding the impact of history on individual lives, the affirmation of self at the end, all of those things, even the diasporic connections, all of those things seem to be there in this text as in others. The one novel, it seems to me, that is different, and that's A Mercy, which is a novel that precedes slavery. And so there's a different kind of imagination that's operating. And because of the setting, because of the time, to me, it's not a novel to be compared to Beloved. It's just a novel that has a different kind of landscape and freedom to talk about slavery writ large or what should I say, the oppression of certain groups. I won't call it slavery, but how we can see that in larger terms. So Beloved doesn't do that, but it's because Beloved is situated in a different time period. But I do think that, so many of the themes and the actions in the other novels also happen here. And this is the first of a trilogy, for example. And so it's resting on history, it's resting on belief, it's resting on the future, all of these things that are happening in Jazz and Paradise and all of the rest of those novels. But and mainly telling the story of how individuals overcame these obstacles and how they saved themselves. And as I said, and I think Mercy is a different take on that because of the timeline.
Thank you.
Yeah. When I think of Beloved in comparison to her other novels, I just see so many commonalities between just about all of her novels. I tend to focus on what they have in common more than what stands out. Trying to, I think you said, how does it rank or relate or measure up or what to our other works? And that's, sort of hard for me. I mean, I only had one opportunity to meet Morrison and I knew that, I had to have whichever, she couldn't sign all of the books. And so I had to choose one. I got slid in a second one, but for her to autograph. And I chose Song of Solomon. And my second one was that she signed for me was The Bluest Eye. But even in Song of Solomon, as with Beloved, she's taking a concept that's seems so far-fetched, and she's requiring you to embrace it. A ghost has come back to life, a dead child has come back to life, and Beloved. In Song of Solomon, that people can actually take up and fly away, based on African folktale. So you see these commonalities, and even in with the bluest eye, although we all know that Pecola doesn't get blue eyes, but she believes that she has blue eyes at the end. And so, something as far-fetched as the changing of eyes for a child who's on the brink of insanity, you just see once again the commonality. And so I'm really trying to reach to find, those things that distinguishes it as different from her other pieces. Not that her, that there's a redundancy, but that she takes similar concepts or strategies and she focuses on different elements of African American history and American history in very unique ways. So I focus on the commonality. I'm gonna have to give us some thought about the distinctive difference.
Right.
Beloved is harder because of the infanticide and all the horrible things that happened during slavery. And so to go there uncut in the way that Morrison does, it's harder than some of the other novels. But I think if you look at it just in terms of categories of meaning, where you have history, and this history is terrible and awful, but there's also the history of colorism and the bluest eye. It's also awful, and the sexism in Sula, and so it's always resting on something that people have to endure. And the slavery thing, rightly so, is the worst. So it's different in that way, in its intensity and what it reveals. But I think it's Morrisonian in the way that it takes the history and moves forward with the people who survived it.
It's sorry, can I just add one thing? Really briefly, I believe Morrison said in an interview that she had actually expected Beloved to be the least read of all of her novels because it was about something that nobody wants to remember. Black people don't want to think about this. White people don't want to think about this. Nobody wants to think about this. Why would anyone read this? But it surely is the most read of her novels. Is it not? It's at least way up there. So something about her presentation of this this material that we all want to forget. I guess it's like that refrain in the closing chapter. This is not a story to pass on, which both means forget about this and also don't ever forget about this.
Well, thank you so much. We're about at 3:30, so I think, alas, this is the point where I have to cut this short a little bit. I think, therefore, what I do now is I say thank you. Thank you all so very much. Been wonderful hearing from you, wonderful learning, listening. I now need to give a few words of reassurance to the audience. Again, not all your questions were answered. If you want them answered, please send them to me. Randall@nas.org, RANDALL@nas.org. I will forward them to the panelists. You get a chance to look at this again. This will be on the National Association of Scholars YouTube channel. We are going to be continuing with more in the Great American Literature series. Age of Innocence is August 30th, and we are starting our new Great American Inventions webinar series, and I believe that's Age of Steam, I think that is, next week, 1 week from today. So all of that, plus a plug, if you enjoyed this, join the National Association of Scholars. We'd be glad to have you as part of us. We do many fine things, including webinar series like this. So, end plug. And just again, thank you to the audience. It's for you and it's with you. Your questions make this possible, the conversation possible. Thank you finally and above all to our panelists. Thank you very much, Dr. Brown, Dr. Denard, Mrs. Yost.